in the US. And currently we are developing an online exhibition on Liang and Lin, focusing on their archives. And yeah, Kira definitely has played a key role in this project. Yeah, and we will share with Professor Steinhardt about our work as soon as our website is published.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, it's 9 now.
Okay. Try to get myself centered in front of the camera here.
So Eileen, has everybody who has signed up, like who has like in the waiting room entered yet?
Yeah, I think they're all here already.
Okay, so we can't see the audience, right?
Yeah, we can only see their like names and profiles.
I see. Oh. Okay, then probably we can start now.
Okay.
Yeah. So, hello everyone, and very welcome to Harvard Chem Lab seminar. I am Chen Lu. I'm the Associate Director at Chem Lab. I'm also a PhD candidate at Harvard University. So today we are very, very honored to have Professor Nancy Steinhardt from University of Pennsylvania to share with us her most recent work on Mongol architecture. And Dr. Nancy Steinhardt is a Harvard graduate, and she is a towering figure in the field of Chinese architectural history. She is also the 2021 recipient of the Alice Davis Hitchcock Book Award, given by the Society of Architectural Historians for her distinguished book, Chinese Architecture, A History. And we would like to extend our congratulations to Dr. Steinhardt for receiving this prestigious award. Dr. Steinhardt is the professor of East Asian art and curator of Chinese art at the University of Pennsylvania, where she has taught since 1982. She received her PhD at Harvard in 1981. She has broad research interests in the art and architecture of China and China's border regions, particularly problems that result from the interaction between Chinese art and that of peoples to the north, northeast, and northwest. Dr. Steinhardt is the author or co-editor of numerous groundbreaking books on Chinese architecture and city planning. Her books include Chinese Imperial City Planning, Liao Architecture, Chinese Architecture and the Bazaar Art, Chinese Architecture in the Age of Turmoil, 200 to 800, Chinese Mosque, and China, an Architectural History. And her upcoming books include The Borders of Chinese Architecture and Yuan, Chinese Architecture, Mongol Patrons. And she has published more than 100 articles on Chinese art and architecture. Dr. Steinhardt's work is foundational to the research of East Asian architecture. Her books are regarded as monuments in the development of the field of Chinese architectural history, and they have reshaped the master narratives of Chinese architecture in many different ways. And today, it is a great pleasure for us to have this rare opportunity to hear her most recent research. Now let's welcome Dr. Steinhardt to give us the lecture under the title, Convergence and Entanglement, Reconsidering the Mongol Architectural Narrative. And I will pass the microphone to Dr. Steinhardt.
Thank you very, very much for that overkind introduction. Everyone can hear me, right? Okay. This is going to be a long talk, and bear with me, we have a lot to cover, and I'm going to start right now. However, and whenever someone first learned about the Mongols, it's likely that she soon afterwards closed her eyes and saw horsemen storming across the grasslands until they came to a wall. They leveled it to the ground, they took the booty behind it, and they slaughtered or enslaved the population. The Mongols did rise on the grasslands of today's Mongolia in the 13th century. They did conquer and level cities to the ground from Eastern Europe to Korea, but they did not have to leave Mongolia to see urbanism or permanent architecture. They saw it across the grasslands. This is just one example of city walls that survive from the period of the Uyghurs, mid-8th to mid-9th century. And as they approached China, they saw it at many of China's borders from as early as the early 5th century. Between the 1220s and 1360s, nomadic populations of the Mongolian grasslands confederated and ruled from 4 capitals. The first was Karakoram, beginning in the 1220s, followed by Shangdu. This is Coleridge's Xanadu, 1256, followed by Kublai's great capital Daidu, 1267, and then the short-lived central capital. In other words, even as they conquered cities across Asia, so in a list in alphabetical order, but these are some of the ones they conquered: Alamut, Aleppo, Baghdad, Bamiyan, Bukhara, Ghazna, Gorganj, Hamadan, Khojan, Kiev, Lahore, Liegnitz, Merv, Mosul, Nishapur, Ray, and Samarkand. Even as they leveled cities to the ground, when it was important to their aspirations, the Mongols also built cities. And what you see on the screen now are 6 of the cities that the Mongols built, not just the capitals, but this one, it will come up again beneath the remains of Xi'an. This one in Ningxia, it will come up again. This will come up only briefly. Olonsum will come up again. Al-Malik, not much. And Heishantou, also not much. In other words, the first unraveling as we begin to try to write a narrative of architecture during the Mongol period is to go to the ground with what was there and what wasn't there, and then to build this narrative up again. Inside the walls of the cities that the Mongols built, including their great capital, Daidu, the descendants of Genghis Khan often lived inside of tents. And the coexistence of tents and permanent construction did not necessarily lead to convergence, which is a term that I borrow from evolutionary biology. Biologists define it as the process whereby unrelated organisms come together to evolve similar characteristics as the result of new similar environments or ecological systems. Although some have suggested it, Mongol construction does not converge with tents. There are suggestions. There were suggestions as early as 1938 that the central buildings of Kublai's city were the center and that everything around them was tents. No, this is not the kind of convergence that I'm going to describe to you. Convergence is a change on 2 sides that merges as one. And in fact, and you'll see this one more time, it's well documented that the person who designed this city where Kublai lived began with a center marker, and there is a pavilion over it, and it was Liu Bingzhong, and it's based on the Kaogongji's description of Wangcheng. This isn't always the process that happens. But this that I've just mentioned to you is an example of one of the processes that we'll see a couple times tonight that's very common when we talk about architecture during the period of Mongolian rule. A map, a picture, a diagram should only be used if there is some kind of text or some kind of archaeological evidence to verify it. So case in point, the famous encyclopedia Shilin Guangji from the 1330s in Fujian. This is a reissue of a Southern Song encyclopedia. Both of the maps here, this one pre-Yuan, it still shows the Xixia. This one post-Yuan, it shows Shangdu, show a very, very prominent Great Wall. But the fact is the Great Wall did not exist in entirety during the Mongol period. And the fact is sometimes maps lie. And there is a famous book that explains the process. It's beyond its second edition now, but Chinese maps are as much a part of this, maps of the Mongol period as other maps, and some famous ones of the Mongol period from the Shilin Guangji, the plan of the northern Song capital Bianliang, which never had a quadrilateral wall. Even this is somewhat exaggerated. And a better example of Lin'an, the southern Song capital, shown here in a gazetteer, but a gazetteer from the 19th century based on the Yuan period that shows a city center and four sides and then a wall around it. And it's well known that Hangzhou didn't look like this. So in this unraveling and reconstructing, which we're trying to do, sometimes we have convergence. But the process that I think one observes more often is what's called entanglement. The first use of the word entanglement was actually Albert Einstein, but it's a term that quantum physicists use now, and it describes what occurs when pairs or groups of particles are generated, interact, or share spatial proximity in ways such that the state of each particle cannot be described independent of the state of the others. That's even when those particles are separated by large distances. This isn't my own suggestion of using a term from physics. Architectural entanglement has come into its own in the last few years. There are conferences on architectural entanglement. It was at one of those conferences that I first learned about it. And it means a building that cannot be fully understood without considering buildings beyond it. This, to me, is one of the core principles to understanding architecture during the period of Mongolian rule. There are a couple other reasons that the period of Mongolian rule, that the Yuan dynasty is so rich for an architectural historian. The first is that there are more than 400 standing buildings, and there is a very, very extensive record from top to bottom in terms of what was built during the period. These are just 9 of the buildings. We are going to look at most of these in some detail to start, just to give you baseline for what we're going to look at after this. Together with this, there are extensive records. There are people like Marco Polo. There are a number of missionaries. I could have put a few other pictures on the screen. There are Persians like Rashid al-Din, and there are many Chinese records, not just people from the southern Song who are watching to their north, but people who were Chinese citizens living under Mongol rule. Next to that are the buildings that I call anomalies. And these are the most interesting ones. And these are the ones, at least three or four of these are the buildings that I'm going to spend more time on tonight. These are buildings that entered China with influences from outside. And these terms, convergence and entanglement, that I'm going to use tonight are the ways that I'm going to explain how Chinese architecture moves forward with these buildings as part of the mix. But let me start here and very quickly show you what's known before we look at the less known. So there is, as I said, an extraordinarily comprehensive, well-documented history of construction in China during the Yuan dynasty. And usually a history of Chinese architecture on the Yuan period would begin with one of these 2 buildings, not only because they represent the highest building standards, and this is a knowledgeable audience, So I can say the highest building standards from Ingzao-Fasher. I'll show you one picture from Ingzao-Fasher. I think maybe I have two in here, but the highest building standards, but also because we have textual descriptions behind it. So so from Ingzao-Fasher, as I said, I have a few slides. They represent Dian, that is what I would call an eminent hall, as opposed to a not quite eminent hall. Sometimes a person can add the suffix tang, but we're looking at most eminent halls, and they are well defined and well understood as buildings like what you see here. And there is also prescription for a multi-story building, and then we'll call it a dianga. In other words, it's got the pillars and the bracket set interface and the mezzanine layer, and then the bracket set interface and the pillars and the brackets and the roof frame. It has the levels of dian into dianga. So that's a given. I don't have to prove to you that Ingzao-Fasher was known and used in the Yuan dynasty. You can read that anywhere and it's a fact. But the next layer that we can add on top of this is that there are two extraordinary records and several lesser records, but these two extraordinary ones that describe the buildings that stood in Kublai Khan's imperial city. The first is by Tao Zongyi. I could have put Nan Chuan here, but it's from Chua Gonglu. It's dated circa 1366. He's a literatus. He's living in the south, and he never saw Daidu. But he wrote about it, and he also wrote about northern Song Bianliang, and it seems to be a fairly accurate record. By the time we get to the year 1396, the Mongols are gone. The man who's going to become the Yongle emperor is sitting in Beijing waiting for his opportunity to go south, to take the throne from his nephew and move the government north. And he and the emperor, the to-be Yongle emperor, Judi, commissions an official named Xiao Xuan to write a record of everything that stood from Kublai city, which he does, and then all the buildings are destroyed to make way for the new capital. When we take those records and read them alongside either the Beiyuan Miao Dening Dian or Yongle Gong Sanqing Dian, we get this. So I'm reading now from Xiao Xuan's description of Kublai's Damingong. Damingong is raised on a platform. In front is the stairway. Damingong, of course, was leveled to the ground by Yongle, if not before, right? This is the text looking at a building from 1270. Surrounding the hall is a marble balustrade carved with figures of dragons and phoenixes. Each vertical post of the balustrade rests on an owl, a sea dragon-like creature, perhaps with a tortoise face, but I think this is what he is describing, rests on an owl whose head protrudes beyond the edge of the terrace. Every outside pillar of the hall is decorated with raised flowers, golden dragons, and clouds, on top of which are carved decoration. So this is excavated at Daidu, not necessarily from Kublai's palace. More of the kinds of creatures that we're talking about could mean this also. I have to turn to Jinse, I have to turn to the 11th century to find an imperial example of dragons entwined around pillars, but it does exist. And again, you're looking at a diantang here. And then I continue on the ceiling, golden dragons and clouds on top of which are carved decoration. In the center of the ceiling is a pair of coiling dragons. Again, I'm inside Deming Hall. On all four sides of the hall are golden and red mullioned windows with gold leaf attached to the intervening spaces. The gold leaf doesn't survive anymore. But from the Yuan period, there are more than one extraordinary example of a text that can be juxtaposed next to extant buildings to make people fairly certain we know what we're talking about. So Three Purities Hall from the Yonggong is very similar. Again, I have a lot to cover, so I'm just showing pictures here for a few minutes, moving down in rank from most eminent to somewhat less eminent. We look at the other two halls of the Yonggong, and to show you what I mean by eminent, the first hall, Sanqingdian, has 3 Caojing. The second hall has 1. The third has none. It has a totally exposed ceiling. Moving down, I come to Guangshengsi Lower Monastery. This is where the Taoist building and the Buddhist buildings are side by side. This site is well dated because it was one of the many buildings that burned in the earthquake of 1303. And then the buildings were rebuilt, this one this year and this one during this period. So here we have what would be about a 5th rank out of 8 building, comparable to the second 2 halls at Yonggong, slightly lower rank here. From the Yuan period, we can distinguish north and south. 3 buildings built within about a 10-year period. In the south, one reads of roof eaves that slope gracefully. Here you see them. One reads of curved beams, and here in a picture, very curved beams. You see them. We can go to Hancheng and see more than 10 buildings that date Jin Yuan, not imperial, not low rank, a mercantile town where a lot of architecture survives that confirms what's in the building standards. We can go down even lower in rank to an extremely humble building, what it looked like when first identified, now an active mountain temple in Henan province. We can look at a house. We can look at nearly 20 stages that survive from Jin and Yuan. And when we look at stages or houses, Yuan is the first time from which one can even talk about popular culture as being understood through architecture. And then there are all the murals, which I won't talk about tonight, but I mentioned when we talk about the change between Song or Jin and Yuan, it's a dramatic change towards a comprehensive building history. So there are murals, not just Yonggong, but there are murals in tombs and Yuan works. So just to review, what was I talking about just now? We know that there should be one intercolumnar bracket set between the ones on top of columns in the Tang Dynasty into Song, and by Yuan there should be 2, and by Qing there could be 4, 5, 6, even 8. We know that roofs slope dramatically and pillars exhibit rise, or they're higher at the corners, and that they're the same height with a very rigid roof in the Qing. And we know that the size of the bracket compared to the column beneath it is about half of this, less, about a third, about a fourth, about a fifth, and about a sixth, and about an eighth. And all the buildings confirm everything that one reads, and even tomb murals do this. So this is just a sketchy painting. It was never colored in. In Chifeng County of Inner Mongolia, here's a pillar, and here are 2 intercolumnar bracket sets. And again, there's no question that Ingzao Fasher is available, and that no matter what's happening to the Chinese population, and no matter how impoverished artists might be, if someone wants a Chinese building, the technology's there, the handbooks are there, and the craftsmen are there. With that in mind, we turn to the buildings that have received, in many cases, much more than the attention I think they deserve. As someone tries to build a case to show that Chinese architecture in the Yuan period is not Chinese, that foreign architecture infiltrated, yes, and changed Chinese architecture. Well, maybe not. So we start with the White Pagoda. It definitely was commissioned by Kublai. A Nepali is brought to court to build it. His name is Arniko. We have his dates. I have them here. And he had worked on pagodas in Nepal and in Tibet, and he comes with more than 20 craftsmen and he builds this building. But look what he does. He builds a beautiful pagoda made of masonry, but made of brick. He knows how to use segments to make a circle, and he puts it behind a gate. This plan, gate, he puts it behind a Buddha hall. This plan, gate, Buddha hall, pagoda on a single line, traces to the 6th century in China. We see it at Yongning-si, gate, pagoda, small Buddha hall. They are reversed here. Korea, same time period, gate, pagoda, Buddha hall. Japan, 6th century, gate, pagoda, Buddha hall, and another gate, or sometimes at the back, one has a lecture hall. So it's put into a Chinese plan. A towering pagoda on the landscape has a very long history. I'm showing you Yongning-si, I'm showing it to you in a reconstruction. It may or may not be an accurate reconstruction, but the monastery at its core did have a gate, a towering pagoda, a Buddha hall, and another gate. And once the architecture is filled in, so even if during Kublai's day, the pagoda stood in isolation, which I doubt, but even if it did, by the Ming Dynasty, it's on an axis of buildings and is filled in, or as you see it today, it projects within the confines of Chinese architectural space. So I want to emphasize that that's a Tibetan Buddhist pagoda. But any other pagoda, and I've chosen a Liao pagoda here, but it doesn't have to be a Liao pagoda. Pagodas always project unnaturally on the Chinese landscape because Chinese architecture is a low built environment. That's why there can be 1, there can be 2, there can be 0 pagodas. They move around. They're always a sign of the foreign faith. And so I don't consider, at least my argument tonight, I don't consider the White Pagoda an extraordinary obliteration of the landscape. My second example, we're going to look at the Huaisheng Mosque, flourishing of the Prophet, flourishing of Muhammad Mosque. The Chinese word used is sage, but this is also this ability of Chinese architecture and Chinese architectural terminology to be very expandable. The minaret projects high on the low built environment inside a mosque and in the city of Guangzhou. There is no need to conceal it. A minaret is no more a requirement of Muslim space than a pagoda is of Buddhist space. It is something that identifies the space. In fact, it projected so high, there are some theories that it was used as a lighthouse. But what we have instead is the minaret in its own precinct, as a pagoda might be, in a plan which is gate, T-shaped approach. Think about the Forbidden City, think about the city of Chang'an, corridor, large yuetai, I assume I can use a few Chinese words, large yuetai and the main hall. And one needs to turn 90 degrees. So you enter here, turn right, turn left. Here's the mihrab that directs space so that prayer can occur here facing Mecca. But if there were a need or a desire to conceal, the pagoda wouldn't be there. its conscientious choice to put this pagoda inside Chinese architectural space. And for comparison, I took this plan from Datong Shanhuasi from the 11th century gate, hall with the yuetai, larger back hall with the yuetai, all one main courtyard here, all one main courtyard. The fact is, Chinese architecture is inherently adaptable. This is one of the beauties of the system. This is probably one of the reasons that it survives so long, because it does have this expansive use. So we have, let's call this imperial. This is Beiyuan Miao de Ningdian, Buddhist, Taoist. If you can't read Chinese, you cannot tell Buddhist from Taoist. Confucian, Jewish. This is a reconstruction of the synagogue in Kaifeng. Muslim, this is the mosque in Xi'an. Residential, funerary, garden. And so mosque space fits right in, and the pagoda becomes part of a Chinese building plan. So I always find it very interesting when I talk about the Beitang, Church of Holy Redeemer in Beijing. The first picture that I took of it here, I took many pictures, but the way that I looked at this was, oh, how interesting. Here's a main hall flanked by two stele pavilion. Now, my colleagues in medieval architecture will say, what an extraordinary example of Gothic, and they'll know the kind of Gothic. But I'm looking at the plan, and this picture was taken early in the 20th century. The Beitang first was built just before the year 1800. So it's not a UN building, but I'm making a point about the ability to use space to converge with foreign architecture. So here's our T-shaped approach. Here's our main structure. And here are all our four-sided enclosed courtyards around it. And so now if we look at the Yongle Gong, one major building always along the main axis. Here it is with smaller buildings behind it, buildings positioned in courtyards on either side of the main axis. And if someone wants a model for how to do this, almost any gazetteer will show it. This is of the Yongle Gong. This gazetteer is early 19th century. And this is the same process that occurred for the White Pagoda. So these are examples of convergence. I want to put this monument in because it's going to come up again. So yes, there is widespread practice of Tibetan Buddhism in China during the Yuan dynasty. And since I just showed you a church, there's practice of Church of the East. There's also Roman Catholicism. But this is a community in the town of Olwon-Sum in Inner Mongolia that is practicing Church of the East. And walls still survive there, and Chinese style statues, and this face, we'll call it a dragon, and statuary that probably is not from a spirit path, it's unknown. I saw these statues, I hope they're still okay. I took this picture about 2 years ago. There was a museum in the process of being built, and the more famous material had already been moved off-site. Again, there's going to be a museum there. This is one of the places where one sees crucifixes on top of lotus petals. But it is a community associated with someone whose name is Georges, and he goes by the English name King George. I wanted to show that to you because it will come up again. My next monument, I'm going from the more obvious to the more complicated. My next monument that comes up in all the textbooks, the observatory in Gaochang, Dongfeng County of Henan. This is one of 5 observatories that were planned by Kublai. Only 2 of them were built, this one and one in Beijing that I'll show you in a few moments. This is the oldest extant observatory in China, and it's the only one for which we have the kind of records that I'm about to use. its purpose is no different from the purpose of the earliest structures for observation of the heavens. The purpose is twofold: observing the heavens, but also mounting the as high as a platform would allow one to mount, and making predictions based on heavenly bodies. And then when it becomes possible, using what one sees in observatory to regulate the calendar. The privilege of observing the heavens is something that was a power of the kings, or the kings since the Zhou dynasty, and then eventually the Chinese emperor. The Dongfeng Observatory is one of 5, as I mentioned, that was planned, and it stands at the foot of the sacred central peak. So it probably had the additional auspicious characteristics of the sacred centrality of all of China. We know a lot about the observatory because, again, there is a text. We know, for instance, that there were 8 Chinese who worked in the observatory. Again, we have Liu Bingzhong. We've talked about him already, Kublai's advisor until his death in this year. Guo Shoujing is a name that's probably familiar to many of you. He's known as an early engineer, but also mathematician and astronomer, and 6 others, some of them skilled in mathematics, but at least one who had no particular ability as far as the records tell us, and he may be one of those who self-identified to save himself at some point during the Mongol invasions. If someone was a religious figure, or if someone was an artisan, or if someone had something like ability in astronomy, there was a chance that he might be saved and be able to work in the Mongol government. So 8 Chinese names, these are 2 of them. There are also at least 4 Muslim names, and these are 2 of them: Nasr al-Din al-Tusi and Jamal ad-Din. And Jamal ad-Din has a biography in Yuanshi. His name in Chinese is Jamal ad-Din. So again, lots of documentation about them. Their roles in the texts emphasize the following. Nasr al-Din, we are told, convinced Kublai's younger brother Hulagu, who at that time is ruling Iran. It's during the period of the Ilkhanate. He is said to have convinced him to build an observatory in Maraga. And then he later comes from there and works at Daidu. So he has experience in both of them. Jamal ad-Din is discussed in Rashid al-Din's History of the World, as well as in Yuanshi. And he's credited with bringing 7 astronomical instruments to China. These are close pictures of what 6 of them might have looked like. That is, if you look up what they are, these are 6 of the pictures that one finds. If you go to the observatory from Mingqing in Beijing today, you can see versions of some of these instruments. That's also a fact. He definitely brought instruments for observing the heavens to Daidu, if not to Dongfeng. As I said, the 2 observatories were built. And these men are mentioned. Rashid al-Din is another source, so we know there are Persians. Now, it's where one goes with the material that I'm going to question. So we have the structure, and since earliest times, the purpose of this structure, which rises 17 meters, is to set the calendar. We know this because the process is described in this text. It's described in Shishou Li. It so happens passages from it were translated by my colleague Nathan Sivan. This book is probably over 20 years old, but I'm giving the book a little plug on the screen because you can read about a lot of this in English. The name for the structure that you're looking at in Yuanshi is not platform for observing the heavens. It's not Wan Xing Tai. That's the name in the Ming Dynasty. The name in the Yuan Dynasty is Gao Biao. So let's translate this as tall gnomon. It's one of three necessary features for an observatory. The second of the necessary features is this rod. And it's, again, you're looking at the observatory today, there has been some reconstruction, but old pictures suggest that this is reconstruction based on an original. So this is placed only to make sure that the lines are perpendicular. And this measure is the third. So that the way it works is that the Gao Biao stands right here. It's not in this picture, perpendicular to this line. The sun's rays come and observers stand and record the rays of the sun. And based on that, they set the calendar. This Gao Biao is a crucial feature, and there's no record that it was used anywhere at any time before the Yuan Dynasty or that it was used in Iran. To me, that's a deciding feature in whether or not this is a structure that came to China from Iran, because people can move and instruments can move, but that doesn't mean that architecture is moving with them. There's excellent documentation about the observatory in Daidu, and this is a reconstruction of it. And buildings here and buildings in general are all recorded. So the functions of rooms at the observatory included offices for the officials for 5 seasonal officials, offices for astrologers, offices for calendar clerks, rooms for the observatory director, rooms for the astronomical observers, a room for water clocks, a room for the supervisor of water clocks, a room for timekeepers, a room in which instruments and supplies were acquired. There's a room for the armillary clepsydra, for the spherical sky globe and a model of the sky. There's a room for printing almanacs. There are rooms for training students in mathematics. There are rooms for astronomy books in computational math and astronomy, etc. This is functioning in part as a place of higher education, where specifically officials who are going to work in the Astronomy Bureau are being trained. This is the building that I showed you just a moment ago. This is the one where the projection comes out in front and where the sun's rays are measured. This is the building that holds the astrolabe, which takes other measurements from the sky. This building is actually not, its function is not recorded, but there are 3 of these. And nevertheless, if you look at the plan, well, I'm showing you Shanhuasi because we looked at it, but I'm showing you here Zhangding Longxingsi, the back part, with the very large and tall pavilion and with the 2 smaller pavilions that are placed symmetrically to it. This Gao Biao is put into a Chinese building plan. So let's then continue on with this a little bit. There is no aspect of the building that you're looking at that would be beyond the capability of a Yuan Dynasty builder. Many of you, I'm sure, know about beamless halls, Wuliangdian. The earliest is later than the observatory. The earliest is early Ming, but Chinese were already experimenting with building buildings out of small bricks. But if you walk into a tomb from, say, the Western Han Dynasty, the kind of brick technology that's being used is something that Chinese builders have done for a very long time. And brick masonry, of course, is something that's used for pagodas. So the fact that the structure appears distinctive doesn't mean it's foreign observatories may have appeared distinctive much earlier than this. We just don't have records of them. But there is today an observatory in Maraga. So this is an air view, and this is taken inside. These are not my own pictures. I've never had the opportunity to visit it. But you do see here the projection. You do see the bar along which the sun's rays would be measured. I know people who have been there. I've asked them about this building. None of them is confident about what the date would be. Today, there's, it's coming, okay, I started, so let me start here. Today, there's no slit in the dome. And this is a better picture of what it looks like inside. But in the 1950s, a doctoral student doing a PhD on Islamic architecture wrote that he noticed a slit in this dome. So it's possible. But if that's the case, let me go back to where I was. If that's the case, it's as possible that China influenced Iran as that Iran influenced China. And here's the reason. What we know about Hulagu's observatory, Hulagu's Kublai's younger brother, in Maraga. So Maraga is in northwestern Iran in the province of East Azerbaijan, is that it had a library, much of which had been moved from another city. The librarian came from Baghdad, and a man named Al-Tusi was responsible for the transfer of the library. This man, Bar Hebraeus, who was a Syrian Christian, worked at the library. So we have higher education taking place. There was a domed building, but historians of Islamic architecture say, well, so many Islamic buildings are domed. We can't say that that's a feature that has to do specifically with the observatory. But another historian of Islamic art, J. Samsho, writes that the Maraga Observatory appears to have been subsidized in a manner ordinarily reserved for schools, hospitals, and libraries. And he continues that in the pre-modern Islamic world, the most common location for education and libraries was the madrasa, the school of higher learning. But during the Mongol period, this kind of higher learning took place at an observatory. So to me, the long history of the observatory as a place of higher learning, if one goes back to Western Han, Chang'an, there is a theory that the Mingtong and the Biyong and the Lingtai were all conflated into one building. So the Lingtai being the place for the observation of the heavens. The multifunctionality of this place where higher learning takes place and where there's a library changes in Iran during the Islamic period, and I think during the Ilkhanid period, and I think that that's something that's significant. It's further known that the astronomical tables of the Ilkhans, that's the English translation, that were produced at Maraga used elements of the Chinese calendar. So I put in the duodenary animals to talk about the Chinese calendar. Certainly there was transport in the direction of the Islamic world from China, just as there without question was transport from the Islamic world to China in the use of the instruments. Now, if we knew what had occurred at Chengdu, there would be better evidence, but we don't. A man named Yang Gongyi, who lives 1225 to 1295, one of the people who worked at the observatory in Dongfeng, had met Kublai in Chengdu in the 1270s. What did he do at Chengdu? That's unknown. There's another record that refers to a place in Chengdu called the Sitiantai, which translates as platform for administration of the heavens. but that might have been a bureau. There's no physical evidence of an observatory, and Wei Jian, who was the chief archaeologist on the project, told me no evidence of an observatory. Some people still believe there was one, but that if there were an observatory in the 1250s, and if we knew what it looked like, then people would be more informed about what the sources of the Dongfeng Observatory might have been. As I've shown you, the reconstruction today, or the remains, and this is a newer dome, in Maraga, do have this bar against which the rays of the sun would be measured. So if somebody could figure out the age of the bar, that would also be significant. But the site itself is further entangled. And this is where it gets interesting, and I will come back to this at the end. So the observatory is high on a hill above the town of Maraga. And below it, between it and the town, are a set of caves. And these caves were first reported in around 1818 by Europeans who were poking around in Maraga and looking at remains and so on. And in 1934, the site was drawn. And this is how it was drawn. And the suggestion came out that by someone named Godard, Andre Godard did this illustration. The suggestion was that this is a cruciform. So this should be, he wrote with confidence, these should be the caves that were carved by Hulagu. For Bar Hebraeus, the librarian who actually was a practicing Christian, and moreover, Hulagu's wife was a Christian, and she also worshiped at Maraga. Now, this is the first of a couple examples I'm going to give you of how, when people are talking about the period of Yuan dynasty, the period of Mongol rule, they will make comments that have no resemblance to truth, but somehow it seems like the fantastic is okay because it's the period of the Mongol hordes. So keep this cruciform in mind. It's not the last time we're going to see it. This is a later version, a later drawing. This is a 21st century drawing. This is Godard, so the caves are actually more extensive than this. But as I said, we'll get back there. We have one more monument to look at before that. This is a brick building that stands in isolation in Guyuan in northern Hebei province. It's the type of building that's nicknamed Dome on Square. And that's what it is. It's a dome on a roughly square or squarish structure. And I'm giving you the characters. Is this Guyuan? There's another Guyuan, which is going to come up also. There are two other buildings in China today that are Dome on Square, but the one that I just showed you was the only one in what we could call China proper. The tomb of Tukuluk Timur, 1363. Tukuluk Timur is of the Chagatai Khanate. He's a descendant of Genghis Khan. He and his entire Khanate convert to Islam, and then he dies in 1363. And this part of the world is going to fall to Tamerlane by the year 1400. So, but again, this is in Xinjiang today. This building is in Karakoto. Genghis had obliterated Karakoto and had obliterated Western Xia civilization, and then the Mongols came and built. It's unlikely that this building would have survived from Western Xia. No, this is exactly what it looks like. There's nothing inside. No one has any idea what its purpose was, but it's as likely to be Mongol period as anything else. Across Kazakhstan, one finds domes on square. This is one that is purported to be the mausoleum of Genghis's oldest son, Jachi. It's very unlikely that it is, but that's what it's called. And so sometimes the dome on square has a front projection that might have some ceramic tile, and sometimes It's more as you see it on the left. But what is a fact is that the Domon Square has a continuous history as only with no function other than a Muslim mausoleum from the 10th century, so the famous tomb of the Samanin in Bukhara, and sometimes there are corner pillars and the Arabata tomb in Tim, and those are its dates. Now, I'm not going any farther than this, except to show you this example. I am in no way suggesting that the Anyang Chodingsa pagoda is a source. I'm emphasizing the fact that nothing that I'm showing you is beyond the capability of Chinese builders for a very, very long time, leading up to the Mongol period. The first record of this building in Guyuan is this one. So unfortunately, there are no Yuan period records or any other records, unlike the White Pagoda or the mosque in Guangzhou that I showed you, or the observatory. There's no equivalent. The oldest record is from the court of Qianlong, when he sends an official to record what he finds in the territory called Chahar, and that official is Jinzhi Zhang, and he writes Kobe Santing. Sure, it's about the 3 regions around Kobe, and the record is revised in 1758 by Huang Kurun. They mention a building called Shuzhuangluo, and they describe this building as you see it here, even with the correct dimensions. The building's described in different yuan of this text, and sometimes it's described as a lo, and sometimes it's described as a ting. So again, this is trying to use Chinese architectural vocabulary to name something up here, maybe a cupola. Nobody uses the word Caojing in this text. Xiliang Ting West Cool Pavilion, that's fine. Shuzhuangluo is a name that comes up because someone writes in the text that this was the appanage of Empress Dowager Chengtian of the Liao dynasty. She lives 932 to 1009, and she becomes regent and then receives these lands from her son after her husband dies in 982. This desire to pay an unknown monument as Liao, if not yuan, is something else that just, it's kind of time for it to end, but this is not a Liao building. There's no reason to think it's a Liao building. Jean and Huang tell us that it was squarish, brick-faced, stood more than 2 zhang, which is about 13 meters in height. And they wrote that there was an entry at the front and only a window at the back. Now this has been sealed in, but they also wrote about northeast-southwest orientation, and this does have northeast-southwest orientation. When one comes inside, this again has been plastered recently, but they saw something inside. When one comes inside, one sees what I would call fangmugo, and then what I would call bracket sets. So 4-sided interfaces with 8, interfaces with the dome ceiling. I'm using the word fangmugo because it's common for interior space as well as underground space. But perhaps we're dealing here with a kind of convergence. So if I see this as bracket sets and corner pillars, the same kind of construction is used in Phoenix Mosque in Hangzhou during the Yuan dynasty, but a closer comparison is another Domon Square tomb in Turkmenistan that belongs to Najim al-Din Kubra. And so this perhaps is a kind of convergence, structural convergence, but we still haven't gotten to the purpose of it, or 2, the wild ideas about it. After Kobe Santinger, the next person who saw this building was a missionary. And his last name was Heerman, A. Heerman. I don't know his first name. He was here in 1898, and he wrote about it in missionary literature. He writes, imposing, a square tower topped by a cupola. And then in the next sentence, he says, this is where Kublai gathered his herds. So all of a sudden, Kublai is part of this building. And he ends by saying, it's possible that under these ruins, the Stelian tombstone with inscriptions that relate the history of past centuries, perhaps of illustrious Christians, will be found. And all of a sudden, there's a Christian context for this building. So let me keep going. Heerman mentions that in 1890, César de Brabande, and he's a shoot missionary, so this means he's Flemish, was told by a reliable source, that's all he writes, a reliable source, that he had seen a white cross of about 5 feet in height, approximately a 4-hour ride from the mission in Zhangbei. Well, Guyuan is about 4 hours from the center of Zhangbei. And he says he himself came back and was never able to find it. So you get this kind of writing in the literature that wasn't even provable then and definitely can't be proved now. But then he says that he saw a stone tortoise base on site. So here's our building in question. So this isn't what he saw, but tortoise bases are ubiquitous for stele since the Han Dynasty. This is one of the ones in Karakoram. Of course, they existed in the Mongol period. Jean and Huang don't mention it in Kobe Santinger, but maybe tortoise bases are so common they don't. I feel like if there had been a stele, they would have recorded the stele inscription, but this is something else unknown. The next person to talk about this is Lawrence Impey, who's here in 1925. He's a member, he's writing for the American Geographical Society, and he's looking for Kublai's capital, Xanadu. He's looking for Shangdu, and he has a very small picture of this in his article. John Mann, who's a kind of semi-popular writer about all things Mongol. He's written biographies of Genghis and Kublai and Mongol women. In one of his books in 2010, writes, we don't know who John Mann was. Maybe he was a spy. Again, this kind of fantastic, outrageous commentary continues in the Chinese literature as recently as the 21st century. Well, a man named Wang Beichun may have known that things would unfold like this. He was here in 1993 and 1995, and he planned to write something about it, but he got very ill in 1996. And as he lay dying, he called his friend Lin Mei Tsun, who's a name that would be familiar, I think, to many of you, historian, art historian, archaeologist of Yuan Dynasty, working primarily in Beijing. He called him to discuss an idea that Lin Mei Tsun promised and did publish posthumously for Wang Beichun. So Wang Beichun gets credit for proposing who the occupant would have been. And I think he was right. And he probably predicted the storm that was going to ensue. Wang Beichun mentioned that there were some other structures in the area. And he mentioned that he saw some glazed ceramic tiles, and they are still inside the building today, or at least they were in 2013. There's a museum being planned here. Also, excuse me. So he saw tiles like this, and he wanted to get his idea out before excavation, which finally began around the year 2000. There is a male and there are two females, and they are in fairly simple wooden coffins. And buried with them were pieces of brocade. Chinese bury with burial goods. Muslims don't. The architecture is the architecture of a Muslim tomb. A Sunni Muslim will bury in an unmarked grave, usually in a large cemetery, and even a Saudi prince would not want his grave marked. In death, all people are equal, and burial is very humble, but not necessarily for a Shiite and not necessarily in China. So let me use this picture to try to explain to you Wang Bei-chun's idea. Wang Bei-chun's idea is that a man named Ananda is buried there. Ananda, yes, the Buddhist disciple. It's a Buddhist name. He was Kublai's grandson. His father's a man named Mangala. Kublai's oldest son, Timur, took the throne after Kublai died, and this is his reign date. By the time he died, his oldest son was dead. But he had two living grandsons, Kaishan and Ayurbawarda, who agree that if they can be the successors, he will rule first. He's the older brother. He'll rule second. He probably didn't expect to die after 4 years. But Ananda is a grandson of Kublai, the son of one of Kublai's younger sons, the son of this man's brother. Ananda's father was a devout Buddhist. His name was Mangala. Ananda, though born a Buddhist, was raised by a Muslim wet nurse and grew up as a Muslim and was a Muslim his whole life. His appanage is Anshi Wangfu. I had shown you this before. This is beneath the ruins of Beijing today, and excavated among those ruins is a magic square with Arabic numerals, real Arabic numerals, and the city, in fact, has been excavated. It's a UN city, and so this is some of the excavation. Kaishan executes Ananda, and Kaishan becomes the ruler, and Ananda has to get buried somewhere. Ananda's appanage, Ananda's territory, Guyuan, spanned from here across Shanxi all the way into a little bit of Gansu and into Ningxia. Now, there is also a Guyuan in Ningxia, and there are some theories that he's buried in that Guyuan, which doesn't make any sense because he was executed in Shangdu, and this is over 1,000 kilometers. As soon as Kaishan takes the throne, he begins to build the central capital, which is a stopping point approximately midway on the main route between Daidu and Shangdu. And this tomb is over here. In other words, to deflect the power of the person he executed, if in fact Ananda the Muslim was buried in this tomb. And so some people, for reasons that I cannot explain, but again, it's the Mongol period. Here is Inchuan. They believe that Ananda should have been buried in Guyuan down here off the map. There has been excavation of Mongol remains in that area. It's Kaichang. The name Guyuan was not even the name used during the Mongol period. There was a capital there. There are some Mongol remains. There are remains of tombs, but Ananda's not buried here. So we have the possibility that Ananda is buried here. But then we have the contending ideas. And the contending ideas begin with these. In the 21st century, later excavation uncovered pieces of brick that you see here. This is Syriac, and this is Kuali Jisa. And this is why I showed you Olon Sum at the beginning. Olon Sum, the town of the Church of the East Christians, the Ongat, whose ruler was Kuali Jisa Georgis. The idea that Georgis was buried here comes up in the 21st century, at which until then, the only contender for who's in this mausoleum was Ananda. But there's another character right here. And in the year 2011, a scholar named Zhou Liang Xiao said that there were many Kuali Jisa in the Yuan dynasty. Georgis transcribes as George is a fairly common name, but the one whose name we see here with this first character died in 1340 and was alive under the last Mongol emperor. But some people didn't like that idea because they don't want to see Ananda's tomb here. So this was again Olon Sum. This King George would have had to have had his body moved from Olon Sum to here to be buried here. These are some of the burial goods. This is a version of a version of Pagspa, but it's a version of Pagspa that was used by Mongol royalty. I know this thanks to my colleague Chris Atwood, but this is the kind of inscription and also gold excavated at Guyuan in Hebei that should have been the kind of objects that would have belonged to Mongol royalty. Now, those who think it is King George's tomb wrote that artifacts with the crucifix had been found. And when the first article was published saying they had been found, it said there is a piece of brick with a crucifix and with a lotus in the side, and nobody could find it. But the author managed to get a picture of it, and he published this picture of it. And so the argument is that it's a Christian tomb. This would, as far as I know, be the only Christian buried inside a dome on square. Then, if you remember, there was this territory, this little region in the back that was, this is my own picture, and this area that Wang Bei-chun had seen. I was here in June of 2013, third week in June. That's when I took my picture. And I was telling somebody about this, who told somebody else about this, and I get a picture taken on someone's phone about 2 weeks after I was there, with a whole set of mausoleums being constructed behind it. So I came back in 2015, and I had this picture with me, and I asked one of the groundskeepers, where are these buildings? And he said, oh, well, we put them up for a ceremony, and then we took them down. This is what it looked like in 2015. It's been gentrified. It's won an award for being a model of green space, museums being built here. There's a theme park nearby, and it's and so they've decided to call it Shuzhuanglo. I had to pay to park. Last time I just walked up and walked in. Now there's a parking lot, there's an entrance fee. And this is being presented as the tomb of a Mongol, but not Ananda, and someone who decided to be buried, since Mongol royalty were not, and with emphasis that the Mongols were very interested in the stars. And so there we go. So that's the entanglement for Guyuan. This man, I told you I'd go on a long time. I'm getting there. I'll get to the end as soon as I can. This man has also caused a lot of stumbling blocks in the understanding of architecture of the Yuan dynasty. This isn't Yehe Diar. I just put this picture in. I found it somewhere of Chinese Muslims. But there is a man named Yehe Diar, who some of your books describe as the architect, and they use very strongly the word architect of Daidu. Yehe Diar does not have a biography in Yuanshi. His name appears in Qin Yuanshi, the more recent or the updated history that was compiled in 1922 by Ke Xiaomin. And then his name gets into a work that of Chen Yuan that gets translated into English under the title of Chinese and Central Asians under Mongol rule or something like that. A book that got a lot of attention that emphasizes the number of foreigners who were working in China under Mongolian rule. Yehe Diar's name comes up with two other people. One of them was a Chinese official who worked in the Board of Works, and another one died in 1268, right when Kublai's city is being built. But we have no evidence that Yehe Diar had an official title or that he worked in the Board of Works. He's a foreign name that is found in the stele of his son, and that stele is recorded in Qin Yuanshi, and he becomes, because it's the Mongol period, the architect of Daidu. We know, I've already shown you this, that Liu Bingzhong was the designer. Architect, no, they were just craftsmen building. There are lots of different kinds of records about artisans in the Yuan dynasty. There are some like Guillaume Boucher, the Frenchman who was captured by the Mongols in Hungary and ends up coming to Karakorum and building the fantastic automaton, the fantastic fountain out of which flows mare's milk. William of Rubruck knew him, met him, and saw the fountain. There's Arniko. He gets a biography in Yuanshi. Kublai brought him intentionally to build. There's Jamal ad-Din. He has a biography in Yuanshi. He may not have designed the observatory, but he worked in the observatory alongside Chinese craftsmen, alongside Chinese observers. Gao Kegong is a name that many of you know. He's also a foreigner from the Western regions who's painting in the Yuan dynasty. There's a lot of excellent evidence for what people did. But somehow, again, in the Yuan dynasty, scholars are seeking to go one step more and look for the more fantastic. I think I have just two more sites. And as I said, again, I'm getting there. I'm going as fast as I can without going too fast. This is another site in Inner Mongolia. This is a cave site. It's called Arjai. It's sometimes known as Bayan Yao. It is a set of 65 rock-carved caves. It rises at the top of a hill. It's about 300 meters across and between 50 and 80 meters deep. It's in a Tokachi, that is in the Ordos. And it has on the face 26 pagodas carved like this, not all together, not in any kind of order, but around the site there are 26, 25 of them are Tibetan style, and one of them is not. There are shards that have been found from as early as Northern Wei, and in fact, there is one cave, and this is the one that I am most interested in, which is a central pillar cave. And some believe this is one of the caves that dates to Northern Wei. There's Northern Wei occupation, there's Western Xia occupation, and there's Mongol occupation. Inside the cave, on the wall near the entry, is this painting, which someone had the very clever idea of interpreting as Genghis, his 4 sons, his 2 daughters, and his principal wife, with a sacrifice being made to him here and maybe here, with monks and with officials all around him. And the justification for that is that Genghis came to this area to recover after his battle with Western Xia, and ultimately he dies as a result of these battle wounds. But the question is, did Genghis ever have himself painted? Would he have had himself painted in this cave? And what? And again, Mongol period, it's got to be Genghis Khan. This painting is in another cave, and it is nicknamed the Genghis Mandala. But this is the painting for which there's better evidence that maybe it's Altan Khan, who you have his dates here. The Mongols never are strong enough to attack Ming China successfully. There is a skirmish, it's called the Tumu incident, but Altan Khan does raise troops, and he's the one who builds Hut, the Blue City, and he does a lot of construction in Mongolia and forms a kind of empire. It probably makes more sense that this was painted during the time of Altan Khan, but this is another monument that's out there, just like all the tombs. And I said I wouldn't talk about tombs, but I thought I would bring in just one picture. There are Yuan period tombs that couldn't be anything but Yuan period, in Shanxi, Liaoning, couple in Hebei, and across Inner Mongolia. About 70 tombs have murals, and many of them with figures have people in Mongol dress, both men and women. And they also have elements like bracket sets. Inscriptions prove that these are actually tombs of Chinese who are wearing Mongol costume. And so this painting is out there, and there's no inscription and there's no way to disprove it. But if this is Genghis, this is the only picture that was ever painted of him during his life, and maybe it's a painting of Genghis after his life. This is what the cave looks like inside. So there are Tibetan Buddhist deities. There's also some more landscape-like painting. So this is Arjai, and the Dunhuang, the Mogao cave, 465, also has been reevaluated, and some people think this may be earlier than the Mongol period, but the paintings of Tibetan Buddhism that one finds here relate to large numbers of Tibetan Buddhism from the Yuan period, and Feilai Feng and Zhuyongguan. So it's possible that this painting is from the Yuan dynasty, but it's not confirmed. Somebody needs evidence. And as I said, I'm trying to reevaluate all the material that's been put into the Yuan dynasty and figure out what we have. What I can tell you is that that it's a modern site, that Mongols today come here to pay homage to Genghis Khan, and they come in May to celebrate his birthday. Now, one of my best examples of entanglement, and I thank my colleague Nikolai Krodin in Vladivostok for giving me permission to show this. Kondoy in the Transbaikal was first excavated by Kislyev. Actually, it was known even before then. It was first recorded in 1798, excavated in 1925. Kislyev does the famous excavation in 1965, and Russian excavators have come back. These are all Kislyev pictures. These are the wooden inserts we've talked about, roof tiles. And another one of our cruciform buildings. So this is a newer plan. It did appear to be cruciform. This is a site in Mongolia that's believed to have been palatial and believed to have been used by one of Genghis's wives or daughters. But it was thought at one point this was a church. There's no thought this is a church, but actually it probably wasn't. The most recent reconstruction is like this, and the reconstructor, is the person who did this, is named Chakef, and he decided to give it very Chinese roofs, and that's not what makes it most interesting. When the excavation team went into the town, about 7 kilometers north of the excavation site, they found this active Eastern Orthodox church. And they looked to old records, and I'm showing you an older picture here. And the records say that around 1805, when the church was built, the local population procured stone from nearby. And it's believed that some of the pieces like this were used here and then refaced and were actually used in the church. This is an extraordinary example of entanglement, probably not intentional entanglement, but again, it's Mongol period and kind of anything goes. And the site of Karakoram also is deeply entangled. I didn't talk about it tonight, but Erdnidzu, the monastery, has the remains of Buddhist architecture from the Mongol period under it also. Now I'm back to the caves, and I'm winding down. Here's the observatory, and below the observatory is a set of caves, and then farther below is the town of Maraga. And so now I'm showing you pictures of what the caves actually look like, and reminding you that it was said that this is where Bar Hebraeus may have come to practice Christianity. So here's the map I showed you before, the Maraga caves. They're now called the Mihri caves, and the site is Imamzadeh Masum. So the site itself has become, it hasn't become Islamicized. The site has a Persian name. This is what the caves look like inside. And people on the screen have a lot of experience looking at Buddhist caves. And in fact, there were Buddhist caves, and Buddhism was practiced in Iran until the period of the Mongol invasions. There were rock-carved caves during the Achaemenid and the Sasanian periods. But one of the chief scholars who's worked on these caves is named Warwick Ball. He writes that Buddhist worship caves were not rare at one time in Iran. He analyzed 11 caves. He made comparisons with Buddhist space in Afghanistan and also in Uzbekistan. He was at this site. He dates it to Mongol period. He says these are Buddhist caves. The current understanding in Iran is that these are Mithric. And if you don't know what Mithraism is, it is a kind of obscure religion that was practiced by the ancient Romans that includes the worship of a bull. In other words, the caves are officially now associated with the greater Roman Empire, with provincial Rome extending as far as Iran, as opposed to Buddhism extending as far as Iran. And again, we work with physical evidence, and of course there are Islamic inscriptions, but I'm looking at caves that if they were in another part of the world, I would have no problem calling Buddhist. But again, it's an entangled site, and some of you know that in the vicinity, this is Zanjan and West Azerbaijan in northwestern Iran. Takhti Suleiman is the site that has produced glazed roof tiles like this. And the site also was once used for fire temple. So again, these are entangled sites. This is how I come to use entanglement, which doesn't always converge. And so here's my final site. And here I'm the one who's going out on a limb. What you're looking at here is nicknamed the VR Dragon. It is in the province of Zanjian, and the rectangle that you're looking at is 600 by 160 centimeters. The site's been published since the 1980s by people, by Italians as well as Iranians, and it is a dragon, and people speculate, is it a medieval dragon? Is it Iranian dragon? Is it a Chinese dragon? There was a rock slide in 2005, and the site came to look like this. And look what you're seeing. It turned out there wasn't just one dragon, there are two. And this is how someone has reconstructed it. So entry, large space. I don't want to go down the route of a Gong plan, but smaller space, and then relief not specified that you see on all sides. So in other words, there is a dragon here, and there's also, this is the same dragon, and then there's another dragon. This, I have it coming up again on the other side. Well, in this climate of the Mongols and things traveling and the fantastic, I'm looking at this dragon. And so the only pictures that come out are the same dragon. This, I believe, is the same side. I don't yet have a picture of the other side, but people in Iran know that I would like one, and I suspect I will get one of these days. But without that picture, I'm looking at dragons on the east and west. So there was a north end. Here we go. There's north is over here. So I'm looking at dragons on the east and west. And of course, I'd love to know what's right here. And there's also some Mukarnas here. And I'm thinking that someone saw, told, heard about, saw some kind of picture of dragon and tiger on the east and west. And this is a tomb which happens to be in Mongolia, where it's kind of hard to, the dragon and the tiger are easy to mix up, but there are lots of them portrayed through much time. So this is something that is in my head, and if it turns out that one is a little bit different from the other, anyway, possibly that is a source of what you're looking at here. So how do I conclude this? As you can see, yes, I'm trying to start with nothing and then begin from the ground and build up and see what exists and what happened in the UN period and what we can really say about it. And I'm showing you all my anomaly buildings here. If Yuan was the ultimate test case of the maintenance of a Chinese building system in the face of foreign enticement, and perhaps it was, we still have to explain the process. We still have to explain a white pagoda and a minaret and an observatory, et cetera, et cetera. I tried tonight, or this morning for some of you, I tried to use processes of natural phenomena, entanglement and convergence to guide me in the absence of the kinds of written documents that I would like to have. I think that entanglement can describe an initial juxtaposition of, say, a Tibetan pagoda or a Muslim minaret or the Gaobiao alongside other Chinese architecture. But to converge requires more. And there are only a few examples, I think, when the actual convergence takes place. there are two other factors that underlie what I'm trying to do. First is that almost every building on which I focused is religious. And fundamental human ideas about the sacred always have to be part of understanding the kinds of buildings that we're looking at, especially pre-modern buildings. I think so. I turn to Eliade since he's kind of universal and easy to turn to. He tells us that one is inclined to sense beyond what is apparent when a sacred structure is the subject. And I think he's right. I think he's probably argued that in many of his books. For the Mongol period, even the anomaly buildings have generated some kind of turn from the building themselves because of this religious plus Mongol context to the fantastic. And that's something I think we have to work very hard not to let happen into final understanding of these buildings. Second, all the buildings that we looked at in the second part, the buildings on the screen, all are built out of their original context. So subjectivity is part of the process and translation cannot but occur. And architectural translation is another theme that people are working with now. Architectural translation is why I thought I would throw something like this out. Nothing's ever an exact copy if there's a verbal description or if there's a picture or if there's something in one place that gets transferred to another place. So what you saw is part of this goal to write a narrative using architecture to inform, to support, and occasionally to write in the absence of written records. What we have are 400 buildings. More are going to be uncovered and things will change a little bit. But I think it's safe to say that almost every building that we have from the Yuan period from now forward will have religious affiliation, will be entangled, will challenge older narratives. And in the end, the buildings themselves will have to write architectural history. So this is what I've been working on. As you can see, it's very much in progress, but I will stop right there.
Thank you so much, Professor Steinhardt, for this fascinating talk that introduced us to these amazing and complex sites of the Yuan period. And I think they are definitely fascinating examples for us to explore this dynamic process of convergence and entanglement of technologies and the beliefs and ideas. Yeah, and it's just a fascinating, and it's and also really kind of encourages us to rethink the overall development of, or what do we really call like Chinese architecture and how we think about the master narrative. Yeah, and I'm wondering if any participants of this lecture have any questions. You can click the button down below, raise hand, and
so I'm not, so I have to probably stop sharing my screen and then I'll be able to see the chat. Yes, got it. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and also, yeah, great. Professor Wang is also here with us tonight. And yeah, and Professor Wang, feel free to give us any comments if you would like to say a few words.
Well, thank you so much. I think Nancy's talk speaks for itself in terms of a breadth, the erudition, and the insight, and really staggering mastery of this wide range of architectural materials and your thoughts. I'm more well. I mean, a number of things that really fascinate me. Among them, the one that are particularly fascinating is actually the Mithrak.
Yes.
Tomb. which, if I understand correctly, I mean, by that time, by the Yuan time, it's pretty kind of late in the game, and they kind of wiped out, were they not? In other words, I'm trying to wrap up my mind with
I mean,
the
you know,
timeline.
some of this material, if it weren't Yuan period, you would never find it. One would never find it in the literature. But I'm reading. I'm reading in English, but I'm reading Iranian websites, and I'm reading article after article that say this is a Mithric site, and I couldn't have made it up. It's too ridiculous.
Yeah. No,
I don't, I don't know who's on the screen, and I hope I'm not offending anyone, and I hope there's no one on the screen who's published this. But if this weren't Yuan period, I don't think anybody would dare to call it Mithric. And that's my thought. Many of these buildings, the missionary literature is also something that I haven't looked at, but there were Christians in China in the Yuan dynasty. And missionaries, 19th century missionary literature is very interested in this. And I start reading this literature and they say, Genghis Khan was here, and who knows, maybe Hulagu's wife is praying to Jesus in these caves. So you have to, but people are reading this stuff. And so there's some delicacy even to giving a talk. That's why when I was asked to do this, I said, well, for this group, sure, but I don't want anybody recording it because but yeah, I mean, the missionary literature, the religious literature, the Muslim literature, because you've heard me talk about the Guyuan tomb, but this buildup of a case that a Christian is buried there, it's a dome on square. It's fundamental. It's got to be some Muslim. If it's not Ananda, then we've got to figure out another Muslim who was there. But it's Yuan period, so it becomes Georgis. Yeah. So it's really it is different. Very different from Liao too. Liao doesn't have this kind of colorful body of literature behind it. It's because there are Europeans in China, and so it's a different kind of, Yuan's a very different kind of period to work in. But the literature is colorful, but it's also kind of shocking to me.
Nancy, also, judging from your background, and also we also have this shared respect for Liang Shizhen, a subject that our CamLab current is doing a really deep dive into the legacy of Liang Shizhen. And I mean, he did the drawing of that Guoshu Jing's observatory, which is in your background.
Oh, and, yes, he did. Yeah, that's right.
So,
that's right. Yes.
Yeah, so he did a very fine drawing of it. Now, the question I have, and I wonder if you have any thought on this, is do you think that, because that's such an architectural outlier in the entire Yuan landscape,
yeah.
On the other hand, because it's an observatory, and given that long-standing Chinese interest in astronomy, do you think that need to be more understood as some kind of later day architectural remain of a long-standing tradition, or ought to be understood as primarily as a Yuan structure?
That's a good question.
What's your take on this?
So if there were, as I said, Wei Jian is the one who told me no observatory at Chengdu. That's, I've got it behind me, so we can all look at it. I think this is a place where there were Muslims, but I somehow want to see it as Chinese. This is also the kind of building the Ming will continue to build. They just don't survive. So, yeah, I mean, this is what entanglement is. It's not convergence. Is it uniquely UN? I'm going to say probably not. But the documents, I mean, that's what makes art history and using physical evidence so exciting. It's the excitement, it's the challenge, and then it's the ultimate frustration if you can't prove anything. How do we use it? I would like to see it as part of a longer history, but it survives as a UN monument. Yeah, no, this is, I've been working on this book a long time. This is, I mean, many people know my dissertation was on UN architecture.
I know.
And I've still never felt that I've known enough to finish the book. I'm working on it again now. I decided during COVID, I'm going to finally come back. I'm going to come back and try to look at everything again. And I'm still not finished because I don't, I mean, at some point, I feel like I have to decide what I can argue, or at least have an argument about each of these, what I called anomaly buildings, these 5 or 6 buildings. And I'm waiting for some magic bullets.
I have to applaud you for the insight with which you end your talk, and a very distinct claim and pronouncement that one of the tendencies, as you said, of the UN period architecture is actually some kind of turn towards the sacred and the fantastic. So
Yeah.
I think even though the physical remains may not fully support that, but I think on the other hand, there are kind of evidence that fully support that, which is that if you look at the paintings left by someone like Wang Zhengpeng,
Yeah.
produced in 1320s or so, that was indeed a time there was a building spree in the capital, and because that's well textually documented. And then we have also the pictorial documentation, those really fantastic architectures that registered in pictorial scrolls that fully testify and support your insight. And I just want to applaud that conclusion. And I think
Thank
that
you.
the
Yeah,
physical evidence may not
you.
fully support it, but I said all other kind of evidence actually do. So I think you're not out on a limb on this.
I mean, yeah, and thanks for coming, because I heard you actually had something else to do tonight. So I haven't, I mean, again, this book is, I feel like I know less now than I knew when I began all this, but we didn't have all the buildings. I haven't really brought pictures in, but do you have any thoughts about this picture of, is it Genghis and his family? And also, do you have any thoughts about the last thing I showed you, the cave with the 2 dragons on either side? Would you, would you put that into a book in the as right now it's the last image, last chapter of the book? Am I playing the same game?
I think you should. You should. It's a fantastic.
I mean, I feel like I'm playing the game that all these people I'm criticizing are playing, right? But when I saw that, I had looked at that since the 80s. That's when these articles came out. And then I read this thing and there are 2. It's really kind of fantastic.
Yeah, it's really, truly is. It's really.
But yeah, so that's what makes what we do fun, right? If I know there are a lot of students on, you should have fun with what you're doing. At the end of the day, however, you got.
No, I'll applaud you for your for the long-awaited UN architecture book.
Well, I hope. I hope. It's very much a work in progress.
Well, thank you, Nancy.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and also, Professor Steinhardt, I have a question about methodology. like now we see like all these very complex sites and see the coming together of different forms from different artistic tradition. I'm wondering if we wanted to go like a step further and to ask like how was these forms were perceived by the builders? Like for instance, the two dragons. Like, does it mean?
So you know, the builders are craftsmen. I don't really see them as thinking, perceiving people. I don't even think that's much of an overstatement. The title of this book, all right, the title of the book is going to be Yuan, Chinese Architecture Mongol Patrons, okay? The patrons, whoever they were and when we know, are making the choices. But I think the builders are bricklayers and craftsmen. So even the two dragons, now that was, you know, that was where at the end when I'm thinking about these two dragons or whatever they are, and I said, well, maybe somebody is holding a picture, but maybe somebody's just saying, you know, there's one that kind of looks like this, and this one, maybe it's a verbal description. This is this scenario building that they teach us in methods is so dangerous. And we all do it, right? So
yeah, I agree. Yeah. The builders probably they are just like following the instructions.
But the builders are illiterate. They may be outstanding craftsmen, but there is something about China. I mean, you know, in some ways, maybe I get a little closer each time I rewrite one section or another section. There are certain kinds of statues that are found in Russia, in Outer Mongolia, and in Inner Mongolia. And the ones from Shangdu or the vicinity, I don't like to use the word better, but they're more skilled craftsmen. So I don't know how to write this. You know, I have pictures to support me, but these are Chinese marble carvers who know how to make marble live outside a plane, you know, how to really make a person feel what marble can do. And the ones in Outer Mongolia and Transbaikal, whatever, that's today Russia, are not as dramatically carved. Again, this is, you know, even you using words, I mean, I've been doing this a lot of years. It's still hard to find the words to say the Chinese are better craftsmen. I'm groping for my words now to carefully say enlivened, deeper, you know, deeper carving, more rising from the plane, whatever. But the craftsmen are, if a craftsman's in Shangdu with the picture and a craftsman's in Transbaikal with the picture, the ones in China probably there are more craftsmen who have better skill and better technique, even if some of them are traveling. But these are things, you know, we build these scenarios in our head, and I don't know exactly who I'm among, but those of you I see are all art historians who work on this material, so we can nod our head. But I can't prove what I just said to you. I don't have craft. I mean, this whole thing of Yehe Diar, there are, Liang Sicheng wasn't part of it. Zhu Qiqian was the spearhead. There, in the early issues of Bulletin of the Society for Research in Chinese Architecture, there are articles on craftsmen, and Zhu Qiqian and others wrote them. And so if you look up from Liao, from Jean and Yuan, you can find lists of foreign names and what they did. But that doesn't, but I mean, a foreign name, you know, Yehe Diar, right? So as it turns out, I asked, well, you know, I have Chris Atwood here. I don't think he's on the screen tonight, but I have somebody at Penn who can answer a lot of questions for me. He said, oh yeah, he came in the Yuan dynasty. So it's because I at first was hoping maybe he'd be somebody with an Arab name who had come in the Tang dynasty and just kept this family name. Now, there are definitely foreigners coming in, but I don't think they're making decisions. But I can't, you know, you can't, and this, by the way, drives historians crazy. right? Because we all know what we're trying to use art to prove. And we all know, I showed 2 pictures and I've used them before, and my little thing, why maps lie or when maps lie. We all know that not every picture is accurate, even though we use pictures all the time, right? So this UN is kind of stretching every aspect of, it's making me question the meaning of what artistry is when I'm trying to do this.
Like really, really fascinating. Yeah, it's just to just think about like all these complex like a decision-making process behind all these sites, like the kind of the intellectual agent that is put the design together. Yeah, I was wondering like how did they perceive all this different artistic tradition and like make the decision to.
And are they even thinking, right? Right. I mean, Guillaume Boucher designs this fountain. He's French, that he's thinking, okay, this guy's probably thinking. Arnie Ko is thinking. He builds this white pagoda. But again, I have some of my own prejudices about what a person has to be a craftsman. Again, and I'm questioning methodology at every stage. If COVID would just end, and I could start traveling again and I'd be going in to teach. I'm in dialogue with myself and the UN dynasty.
Yeah, hopefully the situation will improve
hopefully,
soon.
Yeah, hopefully all of you, whatever side of the Pacific you're on, I hope everybody gets to where you want to be in September.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Professor Steinhardt, we saw a few questions now.
Okay.
One is from Anna, and Anna, do you like to just to explain your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Chen Chen. Yeah, and thank you, Nancy. It's really nice to have your fantastic and really impressive talk today. Yeah, and I'm asking, maybe it's not even a question. I think it's a discussion. Yeah, and it's kind of philosophical. That I'm wondering, to what extent do you often define a change of the genre or maybe a subspecies, like when you see the collage or the transform of the visual elements, or maybe not even visual elements? I mean that when we really talk into a field, that the professions in the field often define the field into very tiny aspects that they different from each other. I mean, when we think of photography, that when they use different solutions, maybe they would call these different types of photographies. Yeah, so when we talk about architecture, yeah, so I remember when you talk about the brackets, that there are different numbers of brackets between the columns. And because they appear in different dynasties, and we would call those different genres. So what if they don't appear in different times? What if they appear together and they only have some visual elements difference? So how do you define these? Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, I think I understand what you're asking me. I think you're asking me if we take more seriously the fact that we see bracket sets, or should we take more seriously whether there's one or whether there are two or whether there are three between the columns, right? Yes. So what do I think? I think that if I'm standing in Iran, or if I'm standing in the far eastern part of Russia, or if I'm standing in outer Mongolia, and I see any kind of bracket set, that's what I take most seriously. If I'm in China, then I'm going to start counting pieces. I think it depends. I think context is very important. I said this a little bit, but a lot of you, I think, know that I think this very strongly. This very, very straightforward, simple, sometimes rigid architectural system that China has given the world has survived as long as it does because it has so much it's recognizable. It's recognizable, it's adaptable. If you see that bracket set, you can be at Kew Gardens, you can be at Tivoli Gardens, you can be anywhere in the world, and China is shining forth. And that's a kind of power that the architecture offers. But in China, people know the details of how to do it. So yeah, I mean, this, the Mongols are one case, but there are Toba, and there are Khitan, there are Uyghurs, there are many people who use Chinese architecture. The first message is always China to me, right? Again, I'm an outsider, right? I personally am looking at this the way I looked at it the first time I saw a picture of a Chinese building. I knew it was China. And so the architecture is always doing it. And so when you put it in the different contexts that I put it in tonight, you got these different layers. But it's, yeah, the roof, the bracket sets. I mean, that's what it's all about. Yeah. That's a good point. That's something that people who work on architecture have to think about. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing out the layers, and I believe the context is really, really significant. Yeah, thank you. It's really inspiring.
Thank you, Anna, for the question. And Jason also raised his hand earlier. Jason, would you like unmute yourself and ask your question? Oh, sorry. It seems Jason said he raised a hand accidentally. Oh, then we can pass on to Lucian.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Steinhardt, for a fascinating talk. So I wonder if we eventually see these building anomalies that featured in your talk within the tradition of Chinese architecture. So why do these anomalies survive or come into being during this particular Mongol Yuan period? And I wonder if external circumstances allow these kinds of architectural anomalies to continue after the Mongol rule, after the second half of the 14th century. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that is a really great question. I mean, in fact, I'm gonna before I say something about do they continue, the fact is that architecture is also extremely political. Again, I don't know who's on the screen, and I'm not making a political statement myself. I'm just making a statement that architecture is political. The way that I first learned about Chinese mosques was by reading a history of Chinese architecture, because they're physically in China. That kind of addresses what Anna asked me too. The way that I learned about Koguryo tombs is because they're in China. Reading about Jian, or I'm reading about Guangzhou, or I'm not reading about Xinjiang, I'm reading about China. So that when you ask me about Chinese architecture, the question is, does the fact that it's physically in China, is that the operative, or does it have to look like China? And then you can answer that in more than one way. This book that you mentioned that's in press right now, this book that I've called The Borders of Chinese Architecture, addresses that question. Chinese architecture stands very, very far beyond China's borders. But if I am part of the Bureau of Architecture sitting in Beijing, writing the official history of Chinese architecture through 300 buildings, kinds of buildings that I read when I was in school, and I guess we all still read, if it's in the provinces of China, it's a Chinese building. Now, how do I answer it? I probably answer it by something that's elevated on a platform, that has pillars, that has bracket sets, that has a ceramic tile roof. And those buildings always survive. And these 5 or so buildings that I showed you still stand. Okay, now maybe there were 35, maybe there were 100 that don't stand. And that I can't tell you how many there were. Not one of them was built again exactly like it is. The Manchus did build white pagodas. Muslims do build minarets, but never again made out of white plaster. That one that I showed you is from the 14th century. This building in Guyuan is built by Muslims in various parts of the world, but there's only this one in China and it still stands. Is it Chinese architecture? Well, it's architecture in China. The last two questions have been very important questions that, that I think this group, since you're looking deeply at what Chinese art and architecture are, these are the kinds of questions that we all ask all the time. And I don't know, maybe that's why I've never written a textbook. I mean, I still don't know how to answer. I know what you're asking me. I'm avoiding the answer. It's architecture in China. Is it Chinese architecture? Depends who's writing the book. Is this building behind me Chinese architecture? Well, under the rubric of the Mongol Empire, I can write a chapter about it. It's built in China, and I'm pretty sure Chinese craftsmen built it. Yeah, that's kind of, you're asking me the fundamental question. I'm avoiding the answer. Yeah. So I can't finish the book.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's very inspiring discussion. Yeah.
Inspiring to, I mean, you're going to finish your thesis. Dissertations are different from books. I tell people that all the time. For a dissertation, you need a topic that's going to work and you're going to finish it. But certain kinds of books don't exactly work. they're just interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then I would come back to another more specific question. Yeah. So Professor Steinhardt, I'm always fascinated by the Gui Biao, the one that's behind you. So
yeah, the observatory.
Yeah, the observatory. Yeah. So I'm wondering, if we just look at its technical aspects, is there any technology or science that is brought or probably brought by the famous Jamaladi?
I don't think so. I can't prove it.
Mm-hmm.
I think building technology probably went from east to west. But I'm often accused of, being a Sinophile and wanting to see everything is coming from China. I think this building behind me probably looked different because it looked like it looked because it was an observatory.
Mm-hmm.
I can see why people would like to see it as coming from Iran because it looks different.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I think Chinese builders put this together, and I think they were told how far to extend the bar in front, and they knew that this galbiao had to be perpendicular to the bar, the metal bar that you see behind me. Yeah, no, as Professor Wong said, this is Liang Sicheng knew about the observatory. Right. I mean, everybody's known about these buildings. These are UN buildings. Whatever that means. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just so amazing to see in Maraga has also this archaeological site.
The Maraga, I know a number of people who have been there. And what's really, and they're all historians. And what's really interesting is when I ask a historian a question, I say, well, was there a long projection like this out in front? And he'll say, I don't remember. I remember there was some kind of dome or something at the top. So I said, well, could you send me some of your pictures? And I do have pictures from somebody who's been there. But what I don't know is if that bar, which is there right now, was there in the 13th century? That's really the question. Or
Mhm.
if that's been elaborated to look like the building behind me.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really intriguing.
It's
Yeah.
really intriguing, yeah.
Mm.
But a name means nothing, and the presence of a foreigner doesn't mean very much either, right? It's, you know.
Fascinating. Let's see. I think there's another question from um 谢 okay, I think I can just read the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you said, thank you so much, Professor Steinhardt. There are so many interesting details. I am curious, why putting the gaobiao in a simple or simplified traditional Chinese courtyard layout? Are these particular reasons maybe practical or cosmological?
No, that's where I feel I'm on very solid ground. It's convergence.
Mm.
It converges into when it becomes part of a Chinese plan, I'm calling it convergence, okay? It doesn't entangle it because it becomes part of the plan. I think that the way I did this is I went from evidence I feel most comfortable about to what's much more speculative. The pagoda is in a Chinese plan. The mosque is in a Chinese plan. Building behind me is in a Chinese plan. The Beitong in Beijing, that's in a Chinese plan. One of the problems with the Guyuan Mausoleum is that nobody knows what was around it. I keep wondering, you know, could there have been 2 walls around it with the front gate and maybe a few corner towers? But it's in a courtyard because it's in China. Because buildings should be inside courtyards, because buildings shouldn't be in isolation. Yeah, that's I think one of the strong arguments. Things can converge into Chinese plans. And when they stand next to each other or have competing evidence, that's kind of how I'm using entanglement. Guyuan and the caves in Mariga are deeply entangled. and the observatory with the caves below are deeply entangled.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I think we just have so much this specimen materials to further explore.
I do read email, and feel free to ask me at a later point. As I said, I'm traveling nowhere this summer. Well, you know, maybe a few car trips or something, but I'm here reading email all the time, thinking about the Yuan dynasty, for better or worse. So yes, feel free to ask me at a later point. It's fine.
Thank you so much, Professor Steinhardt.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, getting a little bit late now from like in the for the audiences in the US. So let me thank Professor Steinhardt again for your precious time to prepare and give us this amazing talk to us, to introduce us to this like very, very fascinating materials. It really it's an eye-opening lecture, I think, for all of us. And we can continue the conversation in the future.
Yes,
And
to be continued. Thank you. All right, I will leave so that everybody feels free to leave after me. Okay, I'm going to get off, and great seeing everybody. Bye-bye.
bye, good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nancy.
My pleasure. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.